I want to welcome everybody this afternoon to our special fireside chat. Now, I think that was either FDR, Fiorello LaGuardia, or I can't remember when the actual fireside chats first occurred. FDR, there we go. So we've updated that to our fireside chat here at the Temple Talks. And it's a pleasure to have Rabbi Moser and Rabbi Fine here to discuss a little bit about the difference between, or the individual understanding of Conservative versus Reconstructionist Judaism and their paths along the way. And we'll see how those paths may have crossed, intersected, and dissected, however they happen to go. They'll have an opportunity to share their background with it, and we'll have a chance to ask questions. I'll let them decide whether they'd like to take questions along the way or wait to the end, but I imagine this is a friendly crowd, so we can handle the questions that would go along the way. And everyone will be able to, now I hope that means that this side is not the Reconstructionist, is not the Conservative. Not
as far as
not as we can tell. All right, so we don't have a mechitza here to separate the sides. That's good to know. Yes, we're integrated all the way around, so really good to hear. And wonderful to see everybody in this beautiful day, and we're here for about an hour. So I turn it over to Rabbi Moser and Rabbi Fine.
Yeah, we didn't decide who was speaking first. Okay.
I mean, I'm happy to talk. I mean, like, so part of how, what are we doing, right? We're talking about two things. Journey, like how, I guess, sort of how we came to our movements, respective movements, or like at least where we are in our respective movements, and also the way that we construe the similarities and differences between the two movements. Is that kind of what we're doing here?
And that's why we wanted to talk also about our own individual stories, because they're not just ideas and ideologies, they're all ideas and our stories for people, you know, and how we find the communities where we end up, or at least at the time where we are now.
Yeah.
So that we thought that personal element, and since you know both of us pretty well, then it would allow us to share a little bit about how we got to here.
Well, do you want to start by talking about your journey,
Sure.
and I'll talk a little bit about mine?
Okay.
Cool.
So I been a conservative Jew my whole life, and as most of you know, my dad is a conservative rabbi also, so that would make it kind of obvious, but it doesn't always work that way. My parents had 3 children, and I'm the only one that goes to a conservative synagogue. And I don't actually pay dues, so I pay in other ways. Yes. I have one brother who's basically conservadox, and he married a modern Orthodox individual, and they kind of been respectful and true to both of their heritages, but they live in Israel now, and there's a davening place on their corner. There is a conservative synagogue. It's not near them. He might have gone if it was walking distance to where he is, but it wasn't significant enough for him to make sure that he was living near a conservative synagogue, so that I don't know if he necessarily identifies a conservative Jew. And my other brother is, there's a new sociological term called the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, and he's one of those. So my parents, like even in a conservative rabbinic household, I guess it's a 33% retention rate in the movement. So my point is just that nothing is ever, it's not like, because I was born in a family that, and we all know with our own children also. I mean, I have ideas for what I think my kids could do, but they're gonna, I feel like I'm ahead if they just listen to me and don't interrupt is enough, So we conservative synagogues. I went to conservative day school through 8th grade. I went to 3 different Solomon Schechter schools because we were moving around. I did not participate in USY, though my brothers did. I know, that's what you do with that. I did go to Prosdor, which was the Hebrew high school program that JTS ran, similar to BCH's JS, but for the whole metro area. At that time, they had like regional schools and the Sunday program. And then after I went away to college, I then went to JTS for rabbinical school, which is the one of the 2 conservative rabbinical schools. At that time, it was the only one in the United States, where I studied to be a conservative rabbi, or be a rabbi. I mean, but it's a denominational school, so you have to there's you have to, it's a sort of litmus test you have to pass when you get in. So for me, it was always where I was, but it wasn't always just automatic for me. So when I was about bar mitzvah age, I had my Orthodox phase, where I was, and this is not uncommon. People that grow up observant in a conservative background feel uncomfortable in conservative synagogues because most congregants are not traditionally observant, not Shomer Shabbat, and we had very close family friends. There was an Orthodox rabbi that I used to go to their house all the time for Shabbos, so there was a time, it was a phase, it ended, and then, so that was in terms of orthodoxy, and then I kind of realized that even though by practice-wise I was more comfortable in an Orthodox world, there were certain things where my practices were more liberal, but also just in terms of thinking and learning about, and we'll get into more about that, the different approaches, the different movements. There was the intellectual sacrifices, in a sense, from my perspective, that orthodoxy demands were things that I wasn't comfortable doing as I started to learn about the different origins of the books of the Torah and how Judaism develops. I knew that orthodoxy wasn't the direction that, there's a lot of learning there that's wonderful learning, but the questions that I was interested in terms of the historical questions, that wasn't the right place for me. I remember at one point, when I was a teenager, I had read a book that's still used today as a textbook called The Many Faces of Judaism. It talks about basically the four movements in America. And I remember being surprised that Reform was the only one that made any real rational sense when I was reading it through, which I was expecting to, go more on the Orthodox side. And then most recently, in the last 10 years or so, in addition to working here at Temple Israel, I've also been teaching part-time at a Reform rabbinical school, the Abraham Geiger College. So I've been working with future Reform rabbis, and a number of them have been interns here, so you've got to know some of them as well. So I've been sort of, and in other ways, been sort of much more comfortable in Reform context than in Orthodox context. So that's kind of which is very different from who I was when I was a teenager. So these are the changes, that we go in life. In terms of Reconstructionism, Reconstructing Judaism, that I guess I encountered that when I started to study at JTS, because the professor that was most influential for me in terms of thinking about religion and God and conservative Judaism in general was my late teacher, Rabbi Neil Gilman, who was a Kaplanian. He was a student of Mordechai Kaplan, and everything he taught was Kaplanian Judaism. And so that was a major part. And he, started off, we would start talking about, well, this is what Heschel says, and this is what Kaplan says, and we had to divide it all into a chart. And Heschel was sort of the more right-wing view, though still a liberal theologian, and Kaplan was the more left, liberal view. And then, but depending on what the issue was, and we did all that. And what I found is when I started, this was in the 90s, when I was at seminary, I used to. We used to say, like, where do you fall? And it was always like writing your own theology and all that stuff. I was always much more Heschelian, and then the more I studied and just the older I got, I just got less and less Heschelian, more and more Kaplanian. So I don't know what that means, but that's why also, it's been comfortable working here with Reconstructing Judaism colleague and working together has been sort of a natural fit for me, I think, because of that training that I got. So I'm going to let you tell, maybe we'll take a question now, or you want to tell your story first?
If you want to take a question, that's
okay,
fine.
Go ahead, Sharon. Yeah.
Were you influenced at all by the Ramah camps?
Yes, I did go to Ramah. I wasn't like a Ramonic every summer, but I did spend, over the course of my childhood, 3 separate summers as camper at Ramah and 2 summers as a staff person at Ramah. And as I guess when I was like bar mitzvah and then beginning high school, it was also very influential also just in Jewish practice and And then but part of that also was the challenge, right? That Ramah is sort of an artificial environment that you're living in, like a bubble that you're, as if we all follow Jewish law. So then when I get home, you're back in the real world. I remember we had a minyan, like an evening minyan in a synagogue, and my father came to me and says, you gotta stop shuckling. Like shuckling when you daven like this. And I'm like, but you sent me to the conservative movement camp, and it's where I learned how to do that. He said, okay, that's very good, but now we're not at camp anymore. We don't do that here. So I was the many different levels of being schooled, in a sense. Yeah.
That's really great.
I still shuck a little bit, but not as intensely as I used to.
I like shuckling. Shuckling's great. Okay, so unlike Rabbi Fine, I have not been a conservative Jew my whole life, but I did start out as a conservative Jew. So, as is probably fairly well known by anyone who knows me at this point, I am a convert to Judaism. I converted back in the mid-2000s in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So I won't bore you with my come to Judaism kind of story, but the long and the really short version of it is that I happened to be living in Japan at one point for about a year. While I was over there, I was doing some very deep soul searching and a little bit of reading. And I had a sort of spiritual moment that really crystallized some things for me and made me realize that I wanted to explore converting to Judaism when I got back home. By back home, I mean back to the States. When I got back, we were living in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or near Tulsa at the time. My initial assumption had been that I would, if I was converting to Judaism, I would probably convert in the Reform movement. But as I sort of embarked on the process, I began to become more attracted to the conservative congregation in our area than I was to the Reform congregation. Part of that reason was just a personal one in terms of I felt like it was easier for me to feel a personal connection to the rabbi at the conservative congregation at that time. But the other aspect of it was the appeal of a more robust framework of practice. I found, for myself at least, that as I became more educated in the nature of Judaism and in the sort of wealth and depth of Jewish tradition, the more appealing I found the idea of engaging with Jewish practice, whether that be in the context of prayer or kashrut or thinking through the sort of decisions in the ethical decisions in my life in a sort of halachic way. I found myself a lot more attracted to a community that at least was having conversations about having this robust framework of practice and having a community that had that as a standard. When I began to think about rabbinical school, which was several years after I converted to Judaism, I was able to attend for the summer at the Conservative Yeshiva in Jerusalem, which is a really amazing just educational institution. They've got some incredibly intelligent and learned people teaching at that community, and it's just a really great treasure of the progressive Jewish world as far as I'm concerned. And that was an incredibly helpful summer for me that I was able to spend there on a scholarship, because it really helped me, number one, to study Jewish text at a level that just wasn't available to me in an American synagogue out in the West. And also because it gave me a taste of what the broader conservative movement was like outside Tulsa, Oklahoma. Because you've got to understand that up until that point, my sole exposure to Judaism and the Jewish world comprised Tulsa, Oklahoma. And that exposure really helped me to understand the theoretical basis of the conservative movement a little better. And that understanding was extremely helpful to me, and I was really inspired by what I was learning, but what was also happening to me at the same time were that it was shedding some light on a couple of areas where it seemed to me that conservative Judaism might not be the best fit for who I wanted to be as a rabbi. Right? It made me rethink my sort of movement identification in terms of, where is it that I want to go to rabbinical school? What kind of rabbi do I want to be if this is what I want to do with my life? A couple of those areas were what I think of as sort of pragmatic areas, right? There, by which I mean areas in which I, felt discomfort with where the conservative movement was at on a particular issue, right? The two big ones for me at the time were that, number one, it seemed to me that conservative Judaism was a little overly concerned with policing the boundary between Jewish and non-Jewish people, particularly the movement's, fairly hard stance toward intermarriage, right? I didn't feel super comfortable with the idea of being part of of going to rabbinical school and then being ordained in a movement where that ordination would essentially impose on me the requirement that I never perform an intermarriage, right? That felt to me not really in keeping with my perspective on what it means to be Jewish in the contemporary world, especially in America, and there was an issue there for me. The other issue that I had at the time was that I had moral objections to what I saw as the movement's dragging its feet on the acceptance of LGBT rabbinical students. There's obviously been a heck of a lot of progress in the movement since that time, and I'm really happy to see that that's happened. But at the time, it felt to me like a pressing ethical issue. And while I had not yet at that point really done the work to come to terms with my own gender and come out as transgender yet, there was certainly within me some feeling that that despite the fact that I was, at least outwardly to everybody else, a heterosexual man in a heterosexual relationship, there still felt like something kind of off to me about the sort of about the what I saw as the slowness of the movement's efforts to kind of address that issue. The other aspect of it, though, I think more than like a simple disagreements on particular practical issues, for me had to do with at least what I saw at the time as sort of a basic issue with some of the underpinnings of the theoretical approach of conservative Judaism's approach to halakha and its approach to Jewish tradition. If I could maybe sum that up in a couple of words, the issue that I saw was what I saw as a disconnect between what the movement accepts or claims about the history and provenance of Jewish text and tradition, on the one hand, and its approach to practice and authority on the other, right? In other words, conservative Jewish educational institutions, whether that be rabbinical schools or the conservative yeshiva or whatever, basically, pretty much openly and comfortably acknowledge at this point that the findings of modern biblical scholarship, right, that understands the Torah to be the work of various human authors with different perspectives that worked over a period of centuries, and nevertheless continues in some ways to treat the Torah, or rather words of the classic rabbinic sages, as though it were infallible and unchangeable divine law. Obviously, the conservative movement is not totally rigid on that point, right? The conservative movement is set up in a very kind of thoughtful and careful way to consider when and how the halakha needs to be changed and to evaluate the avenues that exist within the halakhic system for making changes in response to changes in contemporary socioeconomic conditions and to better reflect our contemporary understanding of moral and ethical values. However, right, to me there felt like something of a disconnect there that really kind of pushed me toward looking a little bit further out afield in terms of my options when it came to Jewish movement, and that's how I ultimately discovered Reconstructionism. When I got back to the United States, I ended up attending a sort of open house week at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. Felt really positive about the people on staff, the faculty that I talked to and their approach to teaching Judaism. Felt really positive about the sense of community that I felt at the college, and ended up deciding that was where I was going to apply to rabbinical school. And that's where I went for a good 6 years. I came out as transgender while I was in rabbinical school and transitioned there. Really cannot imagine having felt comfortable to transition publicly in that way just about anywhere else. So that was real positive for me, right? And at the same time, while I've been comfortable within the Reconstructionist movement ever since, I cannot, in all honesty, say that I've ever been 100% comfortable with certain aspects of Reconstructionism. If I could sum those up fairly briefly, it is this. I am 100% in support of my movement's approach to decision making. I love the communitarian model where the community and not the movement as a whole is ultimately responsible for establishing communal norms through a democratic process. For me, that really speaks to the essence of how I think that Jewish communities actually do in practice and should think about the establishment of communal norms in the contemporary age when we are all, or at least I hope we are all, more or less committed to these ideas of representation and democratic decision making. On the other hand, however, I do not always feel that the actual Reconstructionist communities tend to live up to that ideal of the community coming together to establish communal norms. Most Reconstructionist synagogues I have ever encountered tend to talk about establishing communal norms through a values-based decision-making process while functionally operating in the manner of a Reform synagogue where everybody's basically doing their own thing. The other thing for me is that there's very little about the classical theology of the Reconstructionist movement, what we might call Kaplanian naturalism, that really speaks to me spiritually. I'm much more, if I were in Rabbi Fein's class from back in rabbinical school, I probably would have found myself much more in agreement with the Heschel side than the Kaplanian side. And that's just always been the way it is for me, partially, I think, because I came to Judaism not as a result of, having been born into the tradition and sort of having lived my Judaism sociologically before finding a Jewish theology, but rather by essentially finding God and then following my sense of God and what God wanted from me in my life to come to Judaism, right? So for me, at least, this sort of Kaplanian naturalism that looks at God as sort of like a very impersonal force in the universe has never been one that really appealed to me or spoke to me in my actual living spirit as a Jew. And so that's always felt to me like an area of at least some discomfort. I think ultimately part of what comes out from both of our stories, right, is a sense that to some extent at least there's a certain artificiality to the to movement, to the boundaries between Jewish denominations. Very few people fit 100% and comfortably within the boundaries of a particular movement and its particular stance on whatever, right? And so ultimately we end up making our decisions based on where it is that we can feel most comfortable given the complexity of our actual lived Jewish experience and the families that we have and the communities that we have, et cetera, right? So for me at least, Reconstructionism has been a good home primarily because I'm very committed to its approach to community building and decision making, and less so when it comes to issues of theology, where I end up having to look further afield in terms of, sometimes much more traditionalist approaches to Jewish theology, and that's just kind of how it works.
So that's a beautiful thing that came out, right? That in the discussion that we had never talked about this before between each other, that from an ideological perspective, I'm much more of a Kaplanian, and but we don't join movements. Again, it's not an ideological litmus test unless you got to check certain boxes to get into a rabbinical school. It's more, which community are we most comfortable in, and it's a sense of that being comfortable in the community. What I didn't mention, I should have before, is that when I was in college at Wesleyan, the rabbi there were two different rabbis, but they were Reconstructionist rabbis. In fact, Wesleyan has had a Reconstructionist rabbi for the last 33 years, with the exception of the 2 that I was the interim rabbi there. So, but I'm a Kaplanian, so it's okay. And I just also reflecting on it. I mean, when I was, in those years, you think your college years, your heady years, and the LGBT issue was being hotly debated in the conservative movement then, and then the change was slow, and it was a frustratingly slow process for those who wanted to see a change. And some of the issues that came up, and I was involved, I played some role in that debate, was exactly the issues that the Rabbi Moser was referring to, that some of my colleagues in the conservative rabbinate just cannot conceive of disagreeing with something written in the Torah. And that the Torah's different authors, whatever, they slept late that day in biblical studies, and it just doesn't play a role in their understanding of their theology, which they understand that this is the Torah from God. And I mean, I was at meetings where one of my teachers, Gordon Tucker, sort of turned to the younger members of the law committee and says, "What's the matter with you? You're in a class here. Like, you know you know it, but it just, there's a block there, and there's a difference, and there's there's a sort of a theological divide, and one of the things that characterizes the conservative movement, and from my perspective, I think it's what's ultimately why I'm comfortable in it, is that it's a very large tent, and there's a huge variety. There's a huge variety of theological perspectives, and there's a huge variety of practice. I mean, I was always more interested in, always still am very interested in the question of Jewish law and how Jewish law responds to contemporary issues, and the way I was trained, Serve Rabbi, there always is a way to get to where you want to get to. It's just a process. Story's always told that one of the sayings of Mordecai Kaplan is he used to say, the past has a vote, but not a veto. To which I think in the conservative movement we would say, no, the past does have a veto. There's just a process for overriding the veto. But it's just a clumsy, slow, clanking process, but there is a way to do it, and that's kind of but the conservative movement is a very large tent, and you have to kind of be comfortable with people who hold very variant positions, whether it's political, whether it's theological, and there's an advantage and disadvantage to that, Yeah, so you had a hand up there.
When I was growing up, they said that the people who convert generally go into it completely 100%. Sometimes they overdo it. As a convert, what led you to go even further and become a rabbi?
Sure. So the question is, sorry, I'm just going to repeat questions because, so people can hear. The question is, what led me, once I had converted, to then go like the extra mile and decide to become a rabbi? I think for me, two things, right? One thing was part of how I came to Judaism was through a disillusionment with my previous way of approaching the big questions in life, which was through the lens of academic philosophy. I was a philosophy major. At one point was very much on a track to like go into grad school and become a professor of philosophy, and then ended up having sort of a crisis of faith in philosophy, if that is even a thing that can happen, right? In the sense that what I saw was a lot of philosophers, like there's a lot going on in the world of academic philosophy where people are like trying to answer the big questions of life about who we are and what we're doing here, right? But where that is having virtually no connection to the actual lived experience of any actual real community, right? What I found really powerful about Judaism when I found my way into it was that I saw people wrestling with those same questions, but through, like, in community, right? In ways where the conversations that we have about ideas really have an impact on how we live our lives and on building ourselves up and together as a community. So what really brought me into the idea of thinking about becoming a rabbi was that after converting, I just got really, really into doing stuff in my synagogue, right? I was a quick study. I learned the Hebrew and the prayers pretty fast. Once in a while when my rabbi was out of town, I would be in the sort of, docket of lay people who were asked to lead services, right? I would occasionally give a Devar Torah. I started up a sort of social group of people who are currently in the process of converting to kind of help convey some of the practical how-to details that I felt really weren't covered in the Introduction to Judaism courses, right? I started working in the congregation's library, doing the kind of organizational work there and checking books in and out. So I was getting really involved in my synagogue, and as I was doing so, I was finding that I was really becoming passionate about that work. I loved doing what I was doing in the synagogue. That combined with a number of, friends and, close people in the community who, I remember, I had my adult bar mitzvah maybe like a year and a half after, converting to Judaism, during which I pretty much led the entire service and gave the Devar Torah and read, it was basically the whole shebang, more or less. After which a good friend in the community came up and basically was like, okay, that was wonderful, but when are you applying to rabbinical school? You don't want to take stuff like that super seriously, but it had been something that had been floating around in the back of my mind anyway, because I really loved the feeling of being part of a community, and I loved the feeling of working for a community. Which is why when I, like from the very beginning when I was going to rabbinical school, rabbis do an awful lot of different things. You can do a lot of different things working as a rabbi. For me, congregational work was always it. I always knew that as a rabbi, I wanted to be a congregational rabbi because I love congregations. They are just really neat, just social systems, and I love everything about being like part of a community like this.
Yeah, it's interesting just to add that work that the first time that I had ever imagined actually being a rabbi was actually thanks to my Reconstructionist rabbi at college at Wesleyan. It was the way he approached it is we had our services and we tried to do services different styles from Friday night because community was just one service and have different groups for the different denominations, and students lead from their background. So he said, "Oh, Dave, you can do like the traditional conservative davening because I feel you could do that." And he did more. It was Moshe Halfon, so rabbis. It was all into like meditation stuff that I not do. So he said, "I'll do me, and then next week you can do you." So I said, "Okay, Moshe, sounds great." So, and then I did, and then it was the first, and also just going away to college, but it was the first experience that I had with sort of being in a religious leadership role, which was very different from what I had growing up when I was the rabbi's kid, which is a whole different story. And every time anyone asked if I would want to be a rabbi, I got a little too angrily said, "No, absolutely not." But it started, and I think it was because of that just, open and coming from the groundswell of leadership coming from the ranks, in the sense that Moshe Halfon was great and encouraging, and it was thanks to that I sort of went, direction, and then one thing led to another, and here we are. And that.
So if I understood you correctly, in Reconstruction, God is more of an amorphous concept rather than one deity. And if I understood that correctly, and it's broad strokes, does Reconstruction use the traditional prayers? And if so, how is that aligned when it just talks about one deity and all of that? How does it align with the concept that Reconstruction has? I don't see the matchup.
Great. Okay, thank you. So the question basically is, what is the could I elaborate a little bit more on the traditional Reconstructionist conception of God, and how does that conception of God as a natural force fit in with Jewish prayer, right? Okay, so first thing first, very briefly, what I think of as classical Reconstructionist theology, by which I mean the theology that was articulated by Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, founder of the Reconstructionist movement, and by, say, the first generation or so of his students and disciples, right, was very much a theology so it was a theology that was crafted from one particular perspective. And that perspective was most Jews at that time, or at least a great many Jews who were very much part of the modern world, had problems with the traditional biblical theology of Jewish tradition, right? Because they were very strongly bought into the idea of modern science, right? And felt like the idea of modern science and its approach to nature as something that operates according to unchangeable laws, right, was inconsistent with the idea of a God who exists as a supernatural force that essentially makes miracles happen, right? And so, as a way of providing, as they saw it, a way for scientific naturalists to find a comfortable home in Judaism, Kaplan and others articulated a theology that sees God not as a supernatural force that exists outside of nature and sometimes causes nature's laws to be contravened, but rather as a sort of sum total of all of the forces in the universe which push things in a positive, good direction and not like in a negative, entropic direction. The way that Kaplan used to put it is that God is the force in the universe which makes for salvation. Salvation being anything which pushes us toward our better selves, anything which brings us out of misery and despair, anything that brings us into a place of connection with one another, right? So, Kaplan would often kind of turn things on its head and say that, rather, right, than saying that God is good, anything that we see in the universe which is good is by definition godly, right? That was his particular approach to theology. The Reconstructionist approach to liturgy has evolved somewhat over the years. There have been two editions of the Reconstructionist prayer book. The first one, which was released back in the 1950s, as far as I can remember offhand, and the second one, which was released over a period of time beginning in the late 80s. That first set of Reconstructionist prayer books had a lot more English. A lot of the prayers were pretty radically reworked, right? It was a lot more radical in certain respects than the later Reconstructionist prayer book. Part of what happened there is that the later generations of Reconstructionist rabbis and congregants were a lot less firmly invested in that naturalistic theology than the earlier generation was, right? They were still involved in Reconstructionism and believed in the movement, but why they were there had changed, right? At this point, the Reconstructionist liturgy is fairly similar to the conservative liturgy, with some key changes. One of those changes, of course, is the Musaf has been completely eliminated, right? Primarily, I think, well, for two reasons. The practical one that, there's a lot of folks who attend services who sometimes feel like services go on a little too long, right? And the feeling was that the repetition essentially of the Amidah on Shabbat was not really doing anything for anybody. But I think the theological reason for omitting it had to do with the fact that the sort of part of the core of the Musaf Amidah involves praying for the restoration of the temple, and that's not really a value that most Reconstructionists share. The other big change in Reconstructionist liturgy is that, in general, right, the two sort of key theological components have essentially been removed from the Siddur. One of those is the resurrection of the dead, right? The idea that God is responsible for techiyat metim, right? And the other of which is references to Jews as the chosen people. Not too different in that regard. Like I said, people sprawl across denominational boundaries. In my case, when I'm davening privately from the Reconstructionist Siddur, I continue praying, I follow the Reconstructionist approach in not praying regarding chosenness, right? I strongly don't believe in chosenness, but I privately reinsert all the references to techiyat metim. That's just because, like I said, I've got a much more traditionalist theology in the context of Reconstructionist movement. But yeah, our fundamental, if you looked at the Reconstructionist prayer book and you went through page by page, I think what you would find is that there's a lot more in common with the conservative prayer book than there is different.
How does the humanistic Jew compare to the Reconstructionist?
So humanistic Judaism versus Reconstructionist Judaism. The real difference there is that Reconstructionist Jews affirm the idea of God as a meaningful idea, right? Which is not necessarily what some critics outside of Reconstructionist would assert, right? Famously, Mordechai Kaplan was excommunicated by a small group of Orthodox rabbis for allegedly being an atheist, right? He wasn't an atheist, he just had a very non-conventional approach to talking about God. An approach, incidentally, which isn't too alien from some aspects of Kabbalistic approaches to God, incidentally, right? What he was saying was not necessarily that radical if you look at it in the full context of Jewish tradition. Humanistic Judaism, though, does not have, aside from, rewriting our concepts of God, as far as I'm aware, basically rejects the concept of God and focuses solely on the idea of Jewish community and ethical thought as being sort of the center of their Jewish practice. So, also as far as I know, humanist Judaism tends to be a lot less interested in traditional forms of Jewish practice, but never having been part of a humanistic community, I can't speak to the details of that.
So the liturgy, has an interesting history that Mordechai Kaplan wrote the first Reconstructionist prayer book, I think it was in the 1940s, the same time that the Morris Silverman Sabbath and Festival prayer book came out, which was the standard conservative liturgy until the till 1986 when Sim Shalom came out, and it was the Kaplan Siddur was from a small group of Orthodox rabbis was excommunicated, can't daven from a Siddur from an atheist rabbi, and it was a very important, in the development of the denominations then, because Louis Finkelstein, who was the chancellor of the seminary then, where Mordechai Kaplan taught on faculty, he staunchly defended Kaplan's right to publish whatever he wanted to publish. He said, "There's free, I said, Louis Finkelstein said, I'm not going to daven from your siddur, but you can daven from your siddur in my seminary." And that's why Mordechai Kaplan stayed. That was in the 1940s, and I don't think he left. The Reconstructionist College was founded in 1970 something. Yeah. So it was a generation later, and the reason why the Reconstructionist movement organized as a separate movement with its own rabbinical school and congregational function it was a fissure in the 70s because JTS was just not moving on the ordination of women question. That JTS and the conservative didn't get there until 1983. So there was that in the 1970s in the debate, and then it has a sense like the big tent is just not moving. So those that just couldn't, and that it was a principled secession from the movement by the Reconstructionists. There was always a Reconstructionist wing in the conservative movement, but then those that left said, because we have to allow for ordination of women for these changes, that's not happening in the bigger, but it happened because it was because of that institutional question. Mordechai Kaplan's basic approach to liturgy is, if you don't believe it, don't say it. So it was a very rational, sort of principled approach. But the Silverman, as Rabbi Moser said, conservative liturgy is not that different, right? So Morris Silverman's prayer book also grappled with the Musaf that prays for the restoration of the temple, and a very subtle but radical change was made in that prayer book where he changed the tense of the Musaf, and he changed it from future tense to past tense. Instead of saying, we pray, may the temple be restored where our descendants will offer the sacrifices, it says, we remember the temple which was destroyed where our ancestors offered these sacrifices. So it just makes an historical statement instead of a statement for the future, which my teacher Neil Gilman always objected to, and he said, I always say the future tense because otherwise it has no message of salvation, right? The message is just an historical statement. But I just want to tell that story in a sense that grappling with the issues and how the prayer book can evolve to respond to those issues is something that both Reconstructionist and conservative liturgies have been committed to and have responded to in different varying ways. Oh, sorry, Chrissy, you had your hand on before.
No, Rabbi Klein, I was wondering if you could respond to Rabbi Leiah's explanation of the conservative perspective on modern biblical scholarship.
Sure, I can talk more about that.
Believe in multiple authorship.
Right. The question was, I could expand more on when Rabbi Moser mentioned that in your experience conservative movement, that it just wasn't full acceptance of biblical criticism, the multiple authors and the way the Torah came about. So yes, there's no Bible professor anywhere in any of the conservative seminaries will ever say that the Torah does not have multiple authors. Right, so we follow the Orthodox lowercase o line on that in biblical studies. I think the difference is that there's just been this ambivalence about it. And I actually, many years ago, wrote an article about Solomon Schechter and his ambivalence of biblical criticism. I was doing work in the archives at JTS, and I found, through Schechter's papers, and I found 4 studies that he wrote that were all really deep biblical criticism studies. And he never published them. He never even typed them up because he was just too scared to publish them. So I think, so while it was taught in the classes, when that approach to biblical criticism was taught, most of the students just got annoyed with it. They just weren't it's not that they opposed it, they just weren't interested in it. Like, I don't care the original authors, I just want to know, what do the medieval commentaries say? And they just, and that was what they were more interested, more like a yeshiva style learning, and they just saw it as too academic, and they don't understand how to make that relevant to the way that we study Torah regularly in a liturgical context, in a synagogue context. And we've done, and Bob's helping, we've done a lot of work here at Temple Israel with Ira, who's a wonderful resource for us, and sort of bringing the fruits of biblical criticism to help us understand the Torah as best that we can. There are very, very few conservative synagogues that do that. And there's just this ambivalence, and I think because deep down, and that's when I told you this, I mentioned the story of the law committee's debate on the LGBT question, was that they're just not comfortable with the theological results of saying that if the Torah is not handed to you by God, then why do I have to do these things? And they just haven't thought out a sophisticated theology in being able to answer that question. It was what Neil Gaiman devoted his career to try to fix. Because he said you have all these, you have multiple required courses in Talmud, but there's no one single required course in Jewish theology, and that we don't, and it was like we used to joke about the Jewish Theological Seminary. It's like the Holy Roman Empire. It's neither Jewish theological nor a seminary. So, and there's some truth to that. So it's something that I've done, and I found, and that came across very clearly in the debate about gay, lesbian rabbis and same-sex marriage, because there was a whole group of rabbis that on the law committee, in our process, conservative movement, where we debate the halakhic questions and set the policy, that just could not get past, it says this in a verse in the Torah, and you can't change the verse, you can't change the meaning of the verse because you're changing the Torah, and who are you, we can't change the Torah. And that was a big debate. So I would say there was a significant portion of conservative rabbis that can't conceive of how we can disagree with the Torah. And there are the others, I think the majority, that can conceive about it, but don't quite have the language to be able to do that because they weren't trained to do it through their training, because it just wasn't a part of the ethos of the conservative rabbinical training. The focus is on practice, on Talmud, on Rashi, and doing a Dvar Torah based on Midrash, and just not on how how it starts from and how it came to be. And that's an ongoing problem with that educational culture, which I think you picked up on when you were looking.
So, if I may, when I'm thinking through these issues, I sometimes have reference to a story that I heard first way, way, way back when I was still living in Oklahoma and before I had, even decided to think about going to rabbinical school. And the story is, I think of it as the story of the end of the brisket, okay? The story is told of a young woman who had just moved in with her romantic partner, and she wanted to celebrate, so she decides to cook up a brisket for their Shabbos dinner. Helping in the kitchen, the partner watches her place the brisket in a baking tray, at which point she carefully trims off the last inch or so at the end of the brisket and puts it back in the refrigerator. Curious, the partner asks her why she was doing this, to which she replied, "I'm not sure. My mother just always did it that way when she was cooking the brisket. I think it has something to do with kashrut." The partner, of course, knows a thing or two about kashrut and tells her that they had never heard of such a requirement. So her curiosity piqued, the young woman calls up her mother a couple of days later to ask about the end of the brisket. "I've never been sure," replies the mother. "But it's how my grandmother always did it, and when I inherited her book of recipes when she passed away, it was written right there. And she was always such a good cook that I didn't want to change anything for fear of messing it up somehow." So the two of them decided to go around to the young woman's grandmother to see if she could shed any light on her mother's brisket recipe. And when they told her what they had come to ask, the grandmother laughs. She said, "It doesn't have anything to do with kashrut, and it doesn't have anything to do with the flavor. When I was growing up, the baking dish we used to have was too small for the cuts of brisket that the butcher used to give us, so whenever she made the brisket, my mother would just trim off the end of it and use it for soup later." Upon learning this, the young woman basically has two choices. She could continue to cut off the end of the brisket in keeping with what at this point has become a well-established family tradition, or she could choose, in light of this new information she's learned, to abandon the practice. And I think the key point here is that even if she does continue to cut off the end of the brisket, she can no longer do it in the naive way that she was doing it before. she is now going to have to find a new meaning for the practice. And she is also now ethically responsible for the decision to continue the practice to a degree that she may or may not have been before, right? And I think that the real kind of question when it comes to like what it is that, like how we deal with these differences within movements and across movements is really the sort of extended ongoing argument about what we're supposed to do at the end of that brisket.
No, I just want to add one more thing on the Bible thing, and I'm thinking about brisket also. We have to have, so we have to have lunch soon. But the part of the change and why that, do we just do what we do, right, with tradition, or we look at the origins, how it came about, and ask those questions. It's not just that conservative rabbinical school, the JTS culture, and the other schools there are less interested in those questions, not that they're opposed to it. It's that also, I think in biblical studies, there's been a bit of a shift. Like the focus more recently has been on what's called redaction theory, on like, look at the unity of the text, the way it was put together, rather than the original composite forms that were separate that came together. So where older scholarship would try to figure out what's called source criticism, where they look at the origins. Today is called more redaction criticism. So a lot of biblical scholars are also more interested in the looking at the Bible text as holistic, rather than trying to figure out break it down to the parts that they originated from. In terms of the Chumishes, the Eitz Chaim Chumish, it's not against biblical criticism, but it's not a main focus of it. And it's a very, very different field than from the Plaut or the URJ Chumish, which Gunther Plaut was the editor of. That was written about 15 years earlier, but it engages much more those questions, and that's the sense just of how the type of questions that people ask, and then how it's used in community. And it could be that that's where biblical studies are, but then it comes a question, right? When do we look about why we cut the brisket? Well, sometimes it could be a question. It could be that I don't have enough brisket for everyone. Do I really need to cut off that piece? And sometimes questions come up, and then you need to know how important is it what we're doing, and how did it come about, and that's when those questions come about. You got a question here? I think. Yeah, go ahead.
This is actually a couple of years ago. Reconstructionists changed their name to Reconstructing Judaism, and I didn't like that because you say that the community has something to say about how they participate. I didn't get any letter saying would you like to go for Reconstructing Judaism? I'm not going to put that name. In fact, I never used it. So was that like a halakhic decision that we made? When other groups get together and decide what to change?
Yeah, thanks, Roz. So the issue that was brought up is the decision a number of years ago to change the official branding of the movement from Reconstructionist Judaism to Reconstructing Judaism. I was at least tangentially involved in that process. I can tell you it was not a halakhic process, because very little of what happens in the Reconstructionist movement is a halakhic process, right? What it was what we call a values-based decision-making process, right? So there was an extensive effort that was undertaken to kind of rethink what it is that the movement was calling itself, and to find, a name that would more fully encapsulate what it was that we were about as a movement. The fact that we ultimately ended up making a change and then deciding on a name that was actually less easy to say and use in daily conversation than the old one is, for me, just utterly remarkable. But to answer your question about process, yes, there was consultation of various movers and shakers within the movement, representatives of various synagogues. I know that that there were people heavily involved not only in the RRC, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, or the RRA, the Rabbinical association, but also the various representatives of the Reconstructing Judaism congregational arm. I don't really know that it was necessarily, it certainly wasn't to the level that we were submitting a poll out to every Reconstructionist congregation. As far as I'm concerned, it was maybe not the world's best move, but that's where the official branding is of the movement at this point, and it's, as far as I'm concerned, the branding is maybe like the least important part of who we are and what we do. But like, yeah, honestly, Roz, when it comes right down to it, I'm totally in agreement with you that I'm not really sure that we gained anything by going from Reconstructionist Judaism to Reconstructing Judaism. Like, the amount of time that they spent on that decision was maybe time that could have been spent on other more pressing issues.
It's interesting, though, how names evolve. So conservative Judaism in 19th century Germany was called positive historical Judaism. Then around the beginning of the 20th century, it got changed to just historical instead of positive historical, so that was to make it a little simpler. Then the conservative is better than historical, because what is historical? So conservative started to be used, in the 1920s, 30s. There was an effort in the 70s and 80s to change the name of conservative Judaism to Masorti, which means traditional, and it's what the conservative movement in Israel uses. And it's used in some places in Europe, but it hasn't really caught on because people don't know what the Hebrew term means. Traditional, conservative, Masorti means traditional. It's not that different of an idea. But it's fine. Like in the United Kingdom, conservative Judaism is called liberal Judaism, which is ironic, right? And in Israel, the movement tries to call it Masorti, but do you know what conservative Judaism, what Israelis call conservative Jews? Reform. Yes.
What I hear is that we're slowly moving toward a Spinozian type of philosophy where God is nature is God. Is that where we're going?
I don't think we're going in any one direction in theology. We've talked about Kaplan's ideas that some follow others. There's just as many different theologies as there's always been. I don't think we're moving in any one direction. I think that what I talked about, we were referring before, like Heschel and Kaplan, their influential years is the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 1950s and 60s really, where they wrote their books and influenced a whole generation of rabbinic leaders in America. And that Heschel was really focused. And what I see the difference is as a traditional personal God. He wasn't wedded to, he was accepted biblical criticism, but he believed strongly in a personal God. And I think Kaplan did not necessarily believe in a personal supernatural being who does things in the world. Kind of like when we were talking last Shabbos, those of you who were here, about Harold Kushner's When Bad Things Happen to Good People. A lot of that is influenced by Kaplanianism. But that's a split, and I think that split is still there today. I think there are those that understand God language very literally, and there are others that understand it metaphorically, symbolically, but still find meaning, and that's where it's supposed to come in, still find meaning in the language, and find a way for the language to be meaningful, so very significant meaning in the language, but understand it in a less than literal way. Whereas the third option is to take the language out entirely, which is what the humanists do, right, where they change the language completely. So I think those options have always been there. I think it's fine that they both exist, and as long as there's a dialogue between the different and they're able to speak with each other, then we can all benefit from it.
Yeah, I think that there are areas that we develop and there is progress on, right? I think that in ethical terms, for example, there is absolutely such a thing as progress, where we move from a place of less ethical development to maybe hopefully a place of greater ethical development. I'm not actually convinced that there's any such thing as theological development, right? Because I think that when it comes to theology, like the actual theology that you're going to find personally persuasive is much more to do with the nature of your personal relationship with God, how you personally experience the complex and confusing, mysterious reality that we use such an inadequate term as God to refer to, right? And I think that is so totally idiosyncratic that this is a place where Judaism has actually had it totally right since at least the time of the classical rabbis, which is there has never really been one authoritative Jewish theology, right? Jewish theology has always been a conversation and never been like a set of, official doctrines in general, right? Obviously outside of, for certain very broad areas of agreement, such as, if there is a God, we only have one of them, right? But as outside of that, it's a conversation, and I think that that's really how theology ideally ought to be, because I don't think there's development from less developed to more developed when it comes to theology, because it's such an idiosyncratic reflection of how it is that we personally relate to this reality that we use God language to describe. I mean, sure, our interpretation of the Torah definitely plays into our personal theologies, but I think it's not the only factor, right? I think, for me at least, a big part of my personal theology is influenced by what have at least felt to me like direct personal experiences of the reality that I call God, right? Those experiences I've had in my life have impacted the way that I think about theology and the theological language that I feel most comfortable using, right? But that doesn't necessarily, and here's the key point, right? I don't necessarily think that my approach to theology has any sort of authoritative influence on anybody else's, right? I think that, the Torah is an important influence on Jewish theology, but, one of the great things about the Torah as a document that is composed of multiple sources that were redacted together is that there's actually multiple different theologies that we can find in the Torah, right? The Levitical priests, like the theology of Leviticus, is pretty different from the theology that you find in the book of Deuteronomy. And that's actually super rad, because that means that we've got more theological material to work with and more fuel for that ongoing conversation.
Is there a difference in the denominations between the position or realization of a reparative framework, or going back to what Rabbi Moser was saying, is that also idiosyncratic or just specific to the individual?
By reparative framework, could you maybe expand a little bit on that?
To Kuno Olam, but I think in many places it gets to Kuno Olam gets reduced down to community service. But I think there's a broader, that phrase has this broader connotation of it's an individual or congregational. Actually, I don't even know the some effort to repair this world. And I'm wondering if there's a difference in how that broader, what I'm calling reparative framework, whatever's embedded in Kuno Olam, more than community service, but there's a difference in how either denominations view that term or that broader concept.
Great. So the question then really is, is there a difference in the conservative and reconstructionist movements' approaches to or understandings of the idea of tikkun olam, of repairing the world? I don't know about you, Rabbi Fine, but my general impression personally is that there's actually a lot more in common between the two movements on that particular front than there is different. I think that both movements consider social action in the world to actually improve social conditions and increase justice in the world to be an important part of tikkun olam, and both movements want us to see tikkun olam as not simply a social or political process, but also as a spiritual process.
Right. I think we agree with that. I think that we understand tikkun olam as a extraordinary, as a central component of what it means to be Jewish, but we also understand that as something within the context of Jewish observance. I think what would differentiate both of our movements from the Reform world, where tikkun olam is sometimes emphasized over particular Jewish observance, and there's a generalization there. I think both in Reconstructionism and Conservative Judaism, we want to do tikkun olam, but we want to do it within the context of the celebration of Jewish traditions. Not that that's done in Reform context, but it's just different emphasis there. Yeah.
Totally.
I want to thank everyone today and give Rabbi Moser and Rabbi Fine applause for this delightful discussion. Educationally informative and personally very interesting to listen to those stories. And I'm really appreciative of everyone coming out today on this gorgeous day and sharing this wonderful discussion with us. Thank you very much for being here, and we are much appreciative of everyone and your participation. Thank you, Rabbi Fine, Rabbi Moser. Thank you all for being here. Have a great Sunday.